In this video, we're going to talk about the stages of getting published from start to finish, and I'm focused here on publishing with a university press. Let's dive in. So let's say that you have a manuscript or a book proposal and sample chapter ready to go. The obvious next step is you need to get on the radar of an editor at a university press. I have made an entire video on where to meet editors, both very well-known avenues and then many avenues that people don't think of as much. So the next stage of the process is you make contact with an editor in order to see whether or not that editor would like to look at more material. You do not want to just send the book manuscript or the book proposal and sample chapter as an attachment in your first communication. That is a big faux pas. So this step involves communicating with an editor, giving a very brief description or following the instructions that that press has for new authors on their website. And your goal in this stage is to get an expression of interest and a green light to send something more substantial. Perhaps the proposal and sample chapter right away, perhaps the book manuscript right away, or at the very least, a kind of promise that when you are done with your book manuscript, if you're still working on it a little bit, that they will be waiting and ready to take a look at it and to seriously consider sending it out for review. In this next stage, the editor at that university press will send out your package, whether it's a book proposal and sample chapter or the complete manuscript, out for peer review. And this is a process that can take anywhere from 3 months if you happen to be working with an incredibly time-efficient editor and a series of reviewers, or more likely 4 to 6 months, and sometimes it can drag on even longer. Now, this time process is condensed if and when you are undertaking simultaneous submission. This is the submission of a project to more than one press at a time. I made an entirely separate video about this. Do not, under any circumstance, do simultaneous submission unless you have received the approval of each of the editors or all of the editors involved. You cannot just send your things to more than one person if they aren't aware that you're doing that, and if they haven't given their consent to that. So this process concludes when the editor has sent your materials out for formal review by peer reviewers, anonymous peer reviewers. In the next stage of the process, you get reader reports back from these peer reviewers. These will either praise or criticize, offer areas for improvement. They'll also summarize what they understand the project to be about. And typically every university press, when they sign up a peer reviewer, will provide them a template document to indicate the kinds of questions that they would like to know about. Things about what is the potential audience for this, what are the goals, let's say the scholarly goals of the project, and does the project achieve that? Are there any areas of particular strength or weakness? There's a variety of questions. Each press has its own template, but they kind of overlap in the things that they're after. And most importantly, each one of these reports will ask the reviewer to recommend either, yes, this thing is so strong, it basically can be published with more or less cosmetic changes or cosmetic edits. I recommend publication if the issues that I have outlined in this reader report are addressed. Third, more or less revise and resubmit. That I'm not against the project, but I think that there are things substantial enough that after the edits are made, that the entire project should be resubmitted for either complete or partial peer review again to see if the issues have been addressed. And then probably, I think the fourth category is the scariest, which is do not publish. This can't be improved into a condition that I would deem it worthwhile for press X, Y, or Z to publish. That is the most damning, of course, of possible outcomes. But the others are all shades of good. Obviously, publish it is great. Publish with these revisions is great. Even revise and resubmit is okay. But do not publish is, of course, the end of the road, potentially. All right, in the next stage of the process, you are going to receive as the author a redacted version of those reader reports. I mean, depending on how the reviewer wrote the report, maybe you can get a unredacted version, but sometimes reviewers either give away their identity through something they say, they have a particularly harsh way of writing something that the editor doesn't think is productive for the author to see, and so those things can be removed. They're not essential, that the author just feel bad about themselves, and so they might be paraphrased or they might simply be removed if they don't offer anything substantive. But some redacted version of all the reader reports will be provided to you as the author, and you will be asked to write what is called an author response letter. I made a whole video about what these things are, author response letters, how to write one, and in that video I also offer my own author response letter so that you have a model. I'll put that link in the description and also in the cards. Okay, in the next stage, you submit your author response letter back to the editor. I won't go into what that is, but basically it is your response to the peer reviews, and where you outline what you will and will not be taking under advisement, basically, in your revision process. Now, once the editor has that in hand, they will bundle author response letter, the manuscript itself often, their own report, and possibly a cover letter, and then they submit it to their higher-ups or their parallel advisory board. Their higher-up might be the executive director of the press, or the director of the press, or for university presses who have an ad board, an advisory board, they will submit this package to the advisory board. An advisory board is typically made up of largely of faculty of the associated university. So Columbia University Press often has or let's say Stanford. Stanford University Press often has Stanford professors on some sort of rotating basis from different fields and disciplines to serve on an advisory board. And they are the ones who will review the overall package of materials, the reader reports, author response, the manuscript itself, sometimes cover letter and report from the editor, and then we'll decide whether or not to issue you a contract. And this is something that there is a regular meeting cycle of advisory boards, and if you simply ask, your editor at your press might be able to tell you, the meeting to discuss your book is April 22nd, or is whatever it is, and so keep your fingers crossed that day, and of course I will let you know the outcome as soon as I know. Now, things can get deferred, things can get rescheduled, but I know in the case of every one of my own books, I have known basically the day when I was going to be voted on finally. The next part of the process can bring great joy, great sadness, or kind of a mixture of the two, is you get word of what the director or the advisory board has decided with regard to your project. Congratulations, we would like to offer you a contract to publish with the University of blah, blah, blah press, or in the toughest news of all, that there are issues that we want addressed, or, and this is something that when you get to this stage of the process, I think this is more rare than common by far, where the advisory board might vote against something. I personally have never heard of that happening, because normally if something is going to break down, it's going to break down earlier in the process, but it is within the power of an advisory board or a director to overturn something if they so choose. In the next phase, with contract in hand, you do the revisions that you promised to do in your author response letter and to provide the revised manuscript by an agreed upon date that you and your editor mutually come to terms on. And so this is where you get to dive back into your book, and taking into consideration not only the reader reports, but also your own growth as a scholar. Like, your own views of your book are going to keep changing to the very moment that you send in the final page proofs of the book. And in fact, your thoughts about your own writing are going to continue after you pick up the completed, printed book. So, and in the meantime, I know some things that I have done. I have conducted manuscript workshops, which are sort of a parallel review process that in order to get even more feedback about book manuscripts. So you have all of these bits of advice and ideas and suggestions that you've received either through the formal review process or through your informal networks, and that becomes the basis for the revision process. Revision processes can take a year or more, and the most editors understand this. They understand that they'd rather have it sooner than later, but they know that, especially if there are substantive changes that you need to make, that this is going to take you time. So now you rewrite the book and you produce the next draft. The next stage is to send back the revised book. So this is after you've taken into consideration all of these suggestions and advice, your own thinking, and you revise it and you send it back in. And then the press will take that document and turn it over to copy editors. Now, it might be an in-house copy editor, it might be an outsourced copy editor, but typically this is the moment at which, if it hasn't happened already, that you are no longer actually directly interacting with the acquisitions editor or the editor who first brought you on. Now most of your interactions are going to be with their colleague, whether in-house or outsourced. And so in some number of weeks or months, depending upon their schedule, you will receive back a copy-edited Microsoft Word, typically, document of your manuscript. And this is places where they're trying to bring your work into accordance with the University Press style guide, but it can also be deep tissue, like clarifying language, suggested edits. In my experience, University Press copy editing is pretty light touch. They have too much on their plate, generally speaking. It is far less intensive than, say, the kinds of copy edits you get for writing for magazines or trade presses, but there can be some. So you'll get a document back, typically with track changes, and then you'll go through them one by one on your own to decide which changes you like, which changes you don't, and you can also make further changes yourself. So now this is very important. This is the last moment in the process where you can make substantive changes to your book, because it's still in Microsoft Word, it's in track changes. It hasn't been moved into the page-proof time period. At page-proof, all possibility of major changes stop. So during this phase, you're trying to see what of the track change edits the copy editor made. You agree, don't agree, whatever it is. If they have any queries or questions for you, you can respond to them, typically by adding a comment, but follow their instructions. And you have one more chance to make substantive changes. Add paragraphs, remove paragraphs, add a section. You don't want to add chapters, I wouldn't say, of course, but we're talking about, within the bounds of reason. But you can make substantive changes to your book, and this is the last chance to do so. At the end of this process, you send this resaved document that has your track changes, the original copy editor track changes. You send it back to the copy editor. I always CC my acquisitions editor, my main editor, just so they kind of keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening, but technically speaking, it's going to be their colleague's job, and that's the end of this part. The next part of the process is very exciting, which is that the copy editor, or maybe a colleague of theirs, will turn this track change monstrosity into a page proof. So this is going to be an exact mock-up of what your book is going to look like, with the right font, with the right headers, with forward matter, format, back matter, all of that sort of stuff. And then the next thing you're going to receive at the end of this process, which again can take typically months, I would say. It's a lot. It's a very involved process that involves XML metadata encoding and lots of care and attention, and then page setting and so forth. But at the end of this process, you receive back a PDF document of what your book really looks like, the proofs. This is probably one of the most momentous events in a first author's life, because now the book looks really real. It looks like the real thing, and it starts to dawn on you, if it hasn't already, oh my God, I'm an author. I'm about to be an author. I didn't kind of realize this as I looked at this in Microsoft Word. Your job now is very simple. Find typos. These could be spelling typos, grammar typos. If you work in non-English languages, it might be problems with the romanization, in my case, the romanization of Chinese or Japanese or what have you. But that is the only thing you are allowed to flag and change. The reason is that once you get to the page proof process, they want to make sure that the first word and the last word on every page doesn't change, remains the same. If you make an edit that bumps something to the next page and that bumps everything after that down, that spells disaster for the press, because then they have to go back and basically take another full pass at metadata encoding and so forth and so on. And they will charge you for it. They will you will incur a financial penalty if you propose changes or request changes or demand changes that require substantive changes. Now, if you find a crazy typo or a mistake that they made, well, that's different. That's their fault, not yours. You should not be charged for that. You should go to the mat to prevent that. But if you're kind of being a little bit picky and saying, oh, I'd really like to add one more sentence here, they'll say, okay, cough up the money, because we're going to have to do this process again. So just keep it joyous. Realize that this is an imperfect book. It always will be imperfect. It was always going to be imperfect. And just understand that this is the book, and just focus on the typos. So at the end of that process, you send back to them a PDF document, which typically has inserted comments that indicate typos, or maybe there are some final questions which the press might have, and you can respond to those. But at the end of that process, which typically they only give you a few weeks to accomplish, you send that back, the final corrected page proofs, back to the press. And that's the end of that part of the process. Now comes a sort of amorphous process of many different moving parts. It's not really one thing, it's many different things. One thing is that you're going to be, if you haven't already, been asked to fill out a typically very substantive author questionnaire. Maybe you have already been asked to do this, in which case just take this part of the video and imagine splicing it in. But this is going to be where you are asked what conferences you attend, what book prizes do you think this book might be eligible for, what classes out there or types of classes might this be good to be assigned in, what other books out there are kind of similar or comparable. That's not necessarily on every one of them. What newspapers or magazines would you recommend that this be reviewed in, and do you have any contacts, journalistic contacts, magazine contacts? What kinds of book covers do you like? Please provide some examples of different book covers so that we can show this to our design team. Your bio, any social media handles you have. It's a very extensive author questionnaire that you have to, take some time to fill out, and you want to do a good job with it. That's part of this amorphous process, or this kind of meta phase. Another part of this meta phase, as I just alluded, are discussions about the book cover. I'm going to make a whole other video about book covers, because it is an extremely important and sensitive subject, and one that is just like rife with politics, and it's a minefield, but it's so important. But this is where you're going to start to receive drafts of potential book covers. And what I'm going to tell you now, just as a preview for this video I make in the future, fight for your book cover. You might be a very gentle, collegial person. You need to hold steady and let the press know if they have presented some sort of draft book cover that you think looks like garbage, that you would feel embarrassed to tweet about or post on Facebook or hold up in a photo. How you do that is the subject of this other video. I'll get into that there. But the tricky part of this book cover part of the metaphase is that, technically speaking, you have no authority over the book cover. In most contracts, you have no authority as the author over the book cover. They spell that out quite literally in many of these contracts. And that's because they don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, and they want their design team who has a background in marketing and they feel like they know how these things work. They don't want authors jumping in there. But here's the truth. Many university press book cover designers, I'm sorry to say, are not good at their job. I'm so sorry to say this. At least their first drafts are not necessarily always like spot on. And sometimes they think they know more about the market than maybe they do. Who knows? I don't know what the reason is. But the fact of the matter is that you as the author need to love your book cover. You really do. I'm going to hold tight on that. I'm sure there's some people who are kind of pissed at me for saying this, but I'm going to say that. So that's part of this process too. It's the back and forth of getting to a book cover that you like. There is also the reverse, the back book cover. The back book cover is something that you should absolutely insist on being able to see before it goes to print, because I myself have had 2 typos on the backs of my books and sundry other mistakes. It is the press's fault when this happens, but it's also not, because they're just overwhelmed with jobs. They're overwhelmed with work. But university presses have to get better about this, about involving authors in these conversations, because authors will immediately catch the glaring typo on the backs of book covers. I know of one book, it's not mine, I know of one book that there is a typo on the spine of the book. And you better believe that the reason that there's a typo on that spine is because book covers are not subject to authorial, like, author approval. It's like, well, then you end up with, in this case, it's Japan's minorites instead of minorities. Anyway, so that's part of this meta process as well. Another part of this this process is where you are getting the bits and pieces of the things you need in place. Indexing. In your contract, either the press has agreed to take on the responsibility of indexing, and then they might charge you for it, or that you as the author have agreed to take that responsibility on to find your own indexer, to give them the page proofs, or actually first it's the Word document and later the page proofs of your book. They index it and you pay them directly. Whatever it is, this is the phase of the process when indexing happens. And the reason is you need page proofs complete before you index, for obvious reasons, because you want to make sure that every reference to X, Y, or Z is actually on page 222, 173, 69. You can't do that with a Microsoft Word document. So once page proofs are done, then you can start the indexing process. And then there are things like maybe you might need to provide an author photo if you're going to have one on your dust jacket cover, that sort of thing. So there's kind of like a fun set of materials, a fun set of objects in this phase that you kind of have to deal with all at the same time. Then comes the most important part of the process of all, is at some point an unassuming brown cardboard box arrives at your office or maybe your home, and you open it and you have your complimentary author copies of your book. First book, I'm not ashamed to say, I just started crying. You just think of, it's like you think of how much work went into this. You think about how much you've changed. You think about a lot of things when you hold your book for the first time, how much your life has changed, people who are no longer with you. It's a very strange and wonderful feeling, and you're there, you have it. And at that point, I am not ashamed to say, you should tweet about it. You should Facebook about it. You should send pictures of it to everyone that you know. You only get to do this one time, and you should feel absolutely no apology for wanting to get on top of a mountain and scream out this good news. People love it. Every tweet I've ever seen of someone announcing their book has been just retweeted and liked to the heavens and commented. People just love when other people publish their books. They love it. They love that kind of good news. So you're making them happy too. There's nothing self-serving about it in some sort of, gross way. Do it. And you will have your book many weeks before it is technically for sale. So then you can start to see whether or not the online listings on the press site are correct, on Amazon are correct. You can just start to, make sure that things are looking good. Now, your press is going to do this as well, but it's always good. No one cares about your book as much as you do, so do the work. And then you start to get ready for the release of the book. And that's a whole other video about the kind of social media launch of a book. I won't get into that in this video, but there you have it. That is getting a book published from start to finish, with a lot of little off-ramps if you want to get into the weeds of any one of those phases for which I've made videos. If you got something out of this, please give it a like. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.